André is considered to be one among the greatest theoreticians of realism in cinema. He was born in 1918 in France, a very thin and frail man. He fought for the establishment of the real in cinema like a missionary. He was responsible for the revival of the journal Le Cahiers du Cinéma, and there he could gather a group of young cineastes who later gave birth to the most important cinema movement in the world called the Nouvelle Vague. It is Bazin who gave them the theoretical support, and it is Bazin who altered the meaning of images through his writings. But who was Bazin and why he should be remembered? In order to do that, we should have a look into his theory of time and space. Now, to begin with time, we should remember that in the beginning, all the theoreticians tried to establish cinema as an art by emphasizing that it can deviate from the real. And since it has a right to deviate from the real, it can be turned into a kind of subjectivity, and since cinema can be proved subjective, it can be used as an artistic weapon for the transformation of society. But Bazin reversed the order. He said, the real is a kind of strategic argument for cinema. It is this real which is really a prized possession of cinema, and there he undertook a journey towards discovering the meaning of real in cinema. In his word, the ontology of the meaning of the photographic images. By ontology, what did he mean? He actually tried to put his emphasis on the essence of photographic images. The photographic images, according to him, were more important as a psychoanalytical tool rather than a physical necessity. Since the earlier time, men had tried again and again to win over the passage of time, which destroys everything, which perishes everything. Some kind of insurance was sought. Therefore, mummification was invented in ancient Egypt. Therefore, portrait photo painting was invented in Europe. Somehow, you will have to establish a kind of likeness. And in photography, you could find that this likeness got a formal shape. Louis XVI was like this. This was the order of painting. And when photography came, it created so much resemblance that painting became a kind of marginal thing for the commoners. The victory of moving images became final. With Bazin, it should be said that painting, before the advent of photography, could find a relation between the symbolic and the real. The painters had no problem to establish their perception in the canvas. But it is Renaissance that altered everything. Since Renaissance led us to believe that since man is the most rational animal in the world, he has the potential of representing things which he actually sees. In between seeing and showing, a process was invented, the strategy of locating the perspective. The perspective was a great boon to the civilization along with a great disadvantage. Boon in the sense that it could prove that looking at a representation in a proper way is possible. The Quattrocento perspective, invented by Leonardo da Vinci and his colleagues in Florence, led us to believe that it is possible to see humanly. But along with it, it also cursed us by saying that the meaning of the image is limited. What we see is believable and it is a kind of objectivity, a kind of replacement of the real. Therefore, André Bazin quite rightly said, perspective is the original sin of Western painting. So, painting was torn between two ambitions. One, primarily aesthetic, that of creating a subjective interpretation of the world outside, and two, mainly objective, trying to duplicate the world. The photography intervened during this period. It could apparently solve the conflict between the symbolic and the realist. How? In the sense that it could ideally present a resemblance of the real outside, and secondly, it became more believable for the ordinary people, since camera is an instrument which demands least human intervention. You just click a switch and remaining process is done electromagnetically, electromechanically and digitally. So, people are led to believe that here least human interference has been done. So, photography became a kind of image for the world. And ultimately what happened? Ultimately, we were forced to believe that it is photography which adds something to the existing real, because the reality was there, but our camera positioning and our interpretation of it creates a kind of likeness which is a kind of supplementary to the world system outside. And that is why the surrealists during the 1920s thought that photography is more important than all the other established arts, because it can establish a kind of resemblance in the original reality, and secondly, it never claims to replace that reality, but on the other hand, arranges a kind of conjugal relationship with the real. The age-old conflict between the subjectivity of art and the objectivity of the external world got a kind of resolution. This, in Bazin's opinion, constituted the ontology of photographing image, the essential meaning. The meaning is not there in decoding the actual relationship of the parameters of the external real, but in a kind of psychological domination of the possibility of linking these external images in your psyche. That's the most important thing, because in cinema, what you are given to believe, you believe that because of two things. One, it is the culmination of the Renaissance belief that since I see something, it is also possible for me to show something. Of course, during the 1860s, the Impressionists tried to solve the riddle, but they failed ultimately because they opted for the light parameters only, and with that they had to use their own brush with their own hand, and therefore a kind of subjectivity intervened. Of course, in cinema there is subjectivity, but since cinema is a kind of instrument which processes the real, so the real becomes more viable and more acceptable to people. It is, according to Bazin, it is at the same time an advantage and a disadvantage. Advantage in the sense that for the last 500 years or so, man has strived to attain a kind of space where it is possible, representation wise, to look at a thing seriously and sincerely and with proper meaning. In photographic representation of the real, they did find that nowhere in art, in visual culture, sculpture and painting, it was possible. It was a kind of symbolic rendering. And in photography, you found a true solution. It is Bazin's credit that he could altogether transform the world of the real to the world of the psychoanalytical. The ontology of the meaning of photographic image is a great contribution in the world of theories because it is perhaps the most important contribution from the world of the real to the world of the psychoanalytical. By this time, I think we have been able to establish that photography is a kind of art which is quite different from the established forms. While the established forms of visual culture, painting and sculpture, have their basis on the symbolic rendering of meaning, photography has a direct access to the world of objectivity. Photography creates meaning. How? Because it tells nothing. It speaks for itself. There's a whole credit. That is the credit of the family albums or a landscape that you show what it is. The denotative part and the connotative part of the meaning formation becomes almost equal, which is never to be found in painting, sculpture, literature and other pieces. When you insert a kind of photograph, you can distort it, but people usually believe that despite monstrosities, despite distortions, it is something which has a credential of the real. And Bazin quite successfully established the location of the real in cinematic images when he found that cinema is a kind of instrument which can create a world, a substitution of the real. Through the real, he could establish that cinema is the ultimate form of insurance which gives us a kind of protection against the destruction of our experiences. This happened everywhere. When Bazin analyzed the cinema, he said that though these experiences comprise moments, these moments are so sensuous and can be felt. It can organize human sensations in a better way than the other experiences which are there in other forms of visual culture. This is the ontology of photographic image, that it, through its own objectivity, can create a world which can become the observer's own. Otherwise, the observer remains at a position to appreciate another person's creation. Only in photography, man can be located in a situation when he can feel it is his own, because apparently, as I have told earlier also, it is a process where least human intervention is possible. And in direct contrast to other art forms, objectivity is a kind of privilege of the real. That is why in cinemas, when we see it, when we experience cinema, we think that we are a part and parcel of the whole grand narrative of civilization. In other cases, we remain mute witnesses. In cinema, we become active, and it is because of the meaning that were being formed by the photographic images. Now, with reference to photographic representation, we would take up the concrete examples from painting and photographic images. How does painting differ from photographic images? this may be a concrete question as far as the ontology of photographic images are concerned. You know, when Guernica was filmed by Alain, lot of controversies were generated because Guernica is a great piece of painting, perhaps the most celebrated piece of painting in the whole 20th century, made by Pablo Picasso in 1937-38. When Alain made a film on that, people objected. And ultimately, Bazin came to the rescue of the filmmaker by saying that it is not possible to exactly translate Guernica, the painting, into a kind of moving photographic form. Why? Because according to Bazin, painting is basically centripetal. It draws everything into the center of the canvas and it finds its meaning in centrality. Whereas camera or photographic images are centrifugal, it goes away, and therefore the screen of a film and the frame of a camera cannot be compared. In fact, this is a great contribution because otherwise people, particularly we, the people who are associated with the image world, could think that images, when they are portrayed in painting or when they are filmed in photographs, they convey the same meaning. It is not. In fact, photographic images can give you so many different things depending upon its use of space. The same is the case of theatre. When you consider a kind of proscenium theatre, if you photograph it, you would find that the screen is not the proscenium. It talks about so many things, but the photographic representation of the proscenium is different because it is supposed to deal with the depth parameter of the proscenium in a different way. That is why Bazin could differentiate between the theatrical representation of truth and cinematic representation of truth. In a word, he generally dealt with the photographic images in a sensuous manner, not as a kind of transformer which transforms the meaning of painting, theatre or sculpture into a different kind. Photography, Bazin strongly believed, is not a kind of liaison officer between the worldly experience. It can create its own world. That is why when he discussed cinema, whether it is of Jean Renoir or whether it is of De Sica, he could develop a sense that photography, by using space parameters, can generate different meaning in different situations and can generate a sense of autonomy in the images which are not to be found in otherwise the representations which we find in other mediums of art. This is a unique case. He is the first member of the photographic community who, instead of trying to say that photography has a number of limitations, emphasized the advantages and the differences that the photographic medium has with other mediums. He took the pride of photographic representation by saying that it is perhaps the only medium which gave birth to the Renaissance expectations by creating a world which is not a competitor of the actual real, which never tries to evade the actual real, on the other hand, which tries to supplement the real, which becomes an additive to real, which becomes a corollary to the real, and therefore reality can be enjoyed, can be celebrated only through the photographic images. We can be permitted to use examples from actual cinema, from actual films. Let's talk about Pather Pachali, which is practically a half-silent film. If you look at the clouds, if you look at the trees, the paddy field, through black and white photography, what do you find? There is no word support, but the images are self-revelatory. They speak for themselves, and we can discover the very essence of Bengal landscape. If you talk about Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, what do you find? Charlie, puzzled, confused within a modern industrial system. But how do you discover? How do you invent his helplessness? It is because of the photographic images. They give you a kind of sense of meanings which are inherent in the images. This is the actual meaning of photography. It doesn't speak, it shows. It does not elaborate, it explains. So, we will be talking about André and his theories of photographic images. We will see that while talking about photographic images, he never tried to locate it through a kind of physicality of progression of human history. Rather, on the other hand, he said that the desire for the real can be actually located in a kind of psychological need which was being generated from very ancient times in the mummifications, in the portrait painting, and in the rendering of the actual through images. That is why Impressionism got its ground, which in the history of painting first said that it is light which would constitute the central protagonist role in canvas, and photography intervened to claim more efficiently that light can be used to substantiate the real, and it created a whole lot of new other world, a world of different meanings and horizons. Therefore, we can pay our tribute to André, who gave realism a different meaning.